I'm Bill Turnbull. I'm one of the co-founders of the Faith Matters Foundation. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Philip Barlow from Utah State University. Philip?
I am pleased to be here with you, sir.
Thank you. We just finished quite a conference that was sponsored by my organization, but hosted by you and the good folks at Utah State, the Religious Studies program called New Perspectives on Joseph Smith and Translation.
Yeah, exciting.
Yeah, it was a heck of a turnout. Beyond expectations?
We had plenty of notice early that there was interest for sure, but we wish we had had more chairs.
Yeah, we had people sitting on countertops and floors, but it was good enough that we're certainly glad that we videotaped it, and we thought that we would do maybe a little bit of an introductory conversation here to give a little bit of framing and context to maybe help some of the listeners and viewers get a little more out of the conversation. And so here we are. This conference is held at a state-sponsored university. Therefore, and although the participants are by and large faithful, believing Latter-day Saints, the conference could not be pastoral in nature.
So there's nothing precisely about the conference that was designed to foster faith or to undermine faith, but to account for this. But it does happen that, as I said earlier, we could have invited other kinds of scholars to do other sorts of things. We invited scholars who understand themselves as believing, participating Latter-day Saints who are trying to posit such models, such different ways.
I agree, and as a foundation, it's an interesting situation for us to be in because we're sponsoring an academic conference that is not explicitly pastoral, and yet our mission is pastoral. I have trust, I guess, that this kind of conversation will lead to a deeper engagement with our faith and a deeper understanding potentially. But I'm also aware that this kind of perspective could be disruptive to some people if they encountered it. For some people, it can be an answer because they've already been disrupted just by the reading of the text or by challenges to the text that other people have given. So this provides a way to see how the gift and power of God was manifest in the production of these texts that was a little different than their prior model, but just as meaningful or more meaningful in some ways.
Or even quite different. Disruption can take mild forms or it can take strong forms. Jesus in the Gospels was forever disrupting the models both of his critics and his disciples. What he did for a living was create disruption in ways of thinking, including about the very gospel and who he was. So I think we don't want to throw out babies and bathwaters at the same time, but we need to examine our models because they are surely imperfect. And C.S. Lewis used to call God the great iconoclast who was always pricking the bubbles of our own paradigms.
Exactly. And so sometimes a little disruption is exactly what we need.
It's a synonym for spiritual growth in some respects.
Agreed. I think there's something also about seeing minds of this quality engage each other and also engage the texts and faith that they hold so dearly in the way that they did. And so I guess another in the run-up to this conference, and even we're just days after now, but in the run-up, people were saying, so why are you doing this? I mean, what is it about? And it's kind of interesting. I would often turn the question back, and I would say, well, what comes to mind for you when I say Joseph Smith and translation? And often that answer was, it had to do with the Book of Mormon. Generally, there's an image there. It might be an image of, Joseph with, plates and dictating to someone, writing. More recently, the image has changed. Those are the images actually that we grew up with, and probably I grew up with, and maybe you did too. So more recently, it's become clear that the process was actually, Joseph. Most of the translation occurred with Joseph looking into a hat. Some of the time, early on, there were these interpreters, these ancient interpreters in the hat, and then there was, for most of it, apparently a seer stone that he had used before. And the plates were covered and even not even consulted, so there was some process going on there of translation. But whatever picture you have in your mind, most people think, your mind naturally goes to Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon, but of course there were other translation efforts as well. And this conversation not only covered those, but I think in ways expanded the idea of translation much beyond what we might have considered before, and so very fruitful in that regard. So Phil, what explains to you the tremendous amount of interest in this topic and the tremendous turnout for this conference?
I think there's a lot of people who don't recognize what's at stake in a conversation like this, but there's certainly a lot of people who do, and hence the enthusiasm for engaging at our conference. But what you said earlier, Joseph, our assumptions and church illustrations about Joseph Smith translating the plates, looking at the plates or having them open, and then with the maturing and spreading of historical knowledge, that as far as the historical record goes, that doesn't appear to be the way, or at least the predominant way, that Joseph produced the record that we call the Book of Mormon. So it's not so much among scholars like we've invited to this panel that we're trying to establish gee whiz facts if he did it this way or this way. It's much more profound than that. The role of translator was a fundamental category through which Joseph Smith saw himself. So that's all.
So many of those scriptures have such a hold on us, and they're so deeply inspiring, and they're so much a part of sort of what we consider distinctly Mormon doctrine, and yet the origins of those scriptures are a little mysterious in some ways. The Book of when the church sort of came out and said recently that it's a viable perspective to look at the Book of Abraham as not resulting from the translation of those papyri, but from some other divine process. And so what is that process is really, I don't
a process that Joseph called translation.
Yeah, he called translation.
Not in what people are assuming that word means.
So let's look at what did translation mean to Joseph Smith. We know what it looked like, at least from the Book of Mormon translation. We kind of know what it looked like. We have eyewitness accounts of what it looked like, but we don't know what was going on inside of Joseph's mind. That he never really talked about. He just kind of let the work stand for itself. And there's part of me that says, let's just let the word stand for itself. But there's another part of me that's just curious as heck to want to know what happened. And maybe there's something that we can learn that actually increases our engagement with the text, with these texts. If we study, maybe we're supposed to think about this. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to start with the word translation. If you ask anyone today, I think what translation means, you get a response. Well, it means rendering something from one language into another language. It's pretty straightforward, right? It's a linguistic thing. But I looked up, somebody had me look up, I should say, the definition of translation that was current at the time. This is from the 1828 Webster American Dictionary, Dictionary of the English Language.
Literally produced by the man Noah Webster.
Yes, yeah.
And 2 years before Mormonism was founded.
Right,
so
exactly, yeah. And so this would reflect what the word meant at the time, certainly. And these are I'll just read down, these are very brief, but yeah, translation, the act of removing or conveying from one place to another. One of them is very clerical. It is the removal of a bishop from one see to another. Interesting that this. So translation, and the third one is the removal of a person to heaven without subjecting him to death. It's one very familiar from our scripture.
It is familiar, but we're raised and we get used to that word. He was translated, and then we don't often stop and consciously think about the oddity of that word compared to how we use it in everyday language. But the person was translated. That's a very distinctive, provocative word to attach to this experience.
Taking something from almost a mundane state to a more exalted state, from lower to higher. And finally, you got to go clear down to the fourth definition before you get to the act of turning into another language or interpretation. So translation had a much more broad meaning in the time of Joseph Smith, and it doubtless did to him as well. So it may not be clear to us how Joseph viewed translation because he didn't say very much. We might have to look for, and some of these participants look for clues in the text itself and from other products of Joseph's sort of prophetic output. But we do kind of know some things that Brigham thought about translation. And I had a couple of interesting quotes here. One from the Journal of Discourses I'm going to read, and it speaks to sort of how he viewed the fungibility of both scripture and translation. Brigham said, should the Lord Almighty send an angel to rewrite the Bible, it would be very different from what it is now. If the Book of Mormon were now to be rewritten, it would be materially different from the present translation. According as people are willing to receive the things of God, so the heavens send forth their blessings. And then Patrick Mason, I'm indebted to Patrick Mason for this one. He was reviewing the minutes of the council. Patrick is the chair of Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont University. From the minutes of the Council of 50, Brigham is quoted as saying, if the prophet should translate the Bible 40,000 times over, it should be different every time, because when God speaks, he always speaks according to the capacity of the people. Well, so what do you make of Brigham's comments here?
Brigham seemed to not be bothered by the idea that there's a good bit of Joseph Smith or Joseph Smith's understanding of his culture or inspired, revealed understanding of his culture that comprises his audience. The Book of Mormon is keen to say, liken the scriptures unto yourselves, and that may be more complicated than just this story or that story and relate it to your life, but everything about the Book of Mormon somehow has to be related to what's going on with us, and that
because what you're saying is we translate it as we read it. We liken it. We're invited, in fact, to do that, to liken it unto ourselves, right?
And if we weren't invited explicitly by the text, we still do it. That's how humans access texts, is they can only respond to it with the way their map of reality and their state of their being works. And Brigham seems to indicate, and there's other evidence in the evolution of Joseph's mind and proclaimed revelations that suggest that that's true everywhere. God has to work through limited and evolving, hopefully growing, but not necessarily growing, rising and falling humanity. So when he understands the audience to have these characteristics, to be like this, that's going to affect the translation.
That it brings to mind that sort of expanded notion of translation as moving something from one place to another. In this case, you're actually, the content itself is evolving as you move it from one context to another context, and that could. Brigham evidently wanted the people to understand that translation was more than they thought it was.
Yeah.
Evidently.
But I don't think it's completely liquid, like you get to make it up as you go. There seems to be some sort of tension between that malleability that you're describing and the something that's there, something in the text, in the revelation. So it's a tension point between something that has to remain tethered to, and yet it has to be phrased through the capacity and imagination of the interpreter.
So if we have reason not to believe this sort of divine teleprompter model, if there are clues in the text itself that may be not the way it happened, and if we're to believe Brigham Young that in fact Joseph was involved in the rendering of this text, and by the way, that did not make the text less meaningful or less credible to Brigham. It apparently made it more meaningful and more credible. Then we're at some other model of translation where even if you accept Skousen's loose control, sort of that idea where, well, he has distinct ideas that he's rendering in his own language, even if it's only that amount of translator agency. There's some agency, there's some of Joseph Smith in there. That becomes the jumping off point, I think, to these participants who are going to, I think in general, sketch out a little bit more expansive view of Joseph's role in translation in some ways, but really redefining the paradigm of what a seer is. Because translation in this case, and some of the participants would argue that there was an aspect of seership, that Joseph was simply seeing and connecting dots across time and space that that are remarkable and that constitute this greatest of all the prophetic gifts, which is seership, right?
Again, not merely as a matter of technical curiosity, but rather fundamentally, what is the essence of the nature of seership? For instance, going on, what is behind this word prophet or seer in the instance of this historical person, Joseph Smith?